Okay, let's take a quick look through what the book has to say about the 1980s. Now, again, this book is focused on popular music, so we don't get quite as much coverage on rock and roll, and that's why I was trying to talk to you a little bit more about some of these artists here, and especially that glam metal movement. But in the early 1980s, we saw that reduction in record sales for the first time. Again, that probably has more to do with baby boomers not buying as many records because they're going into the workforce and they are satisfied with the music they have. They're listening to records that they already bought. They're listening to FM radio stations that are playing the music they want to hear. So record companies are going to be scrambling around about what to do, and they find a new set of artists that come out right around 1980 that they can market to younger people. And some of these artists are listed here in the book: Michael Jackson, Madonna, Prince being some of the biggest. Another issue I'd mentioned previously was that idea of the cassette player and being able to duplicate songs or record them off the radio without having to pay for them, and that obviously affected the industry as well. In 1984, for the first time, we see that there are more cassettes sold than vinyl discs for the first time. That was a pretty big deal. We talked briefly earlier about CDs, and CDs will become the main way of purchasing music by the 1990s. So this technology is going to emerge throughout the 80s. By 1988, more CDs are being sold than vinyl discs. And so vinyl is going to go away. That LP record that we had that came out in the 1960s is going to start to disappear. And CDs are going to cost more than records. They're able to sell them for more because the people want them and they sound better and they're new things. It's a marketing technique. We're going to see the emergence of the sequencing and sampling. And remember that those techniques are not going to be used in rock and roll. Rock and roll is going to reject that new technology, which is odd. This is sort of the first new technology rock is going to reject, right? Rock's going to say, you know what? Yeah, we looked at the synthesizer. We looked at MIDI. We decided, no, it's not for us. One of the defining features of rock and roll. MTV brings a whole new way of selling people on music through the integration of music and visual artistry, and created a whole new generation of rock superstars. So these artists, many of them, the ones that sold the most records, are going to be very friendly with MTV. They're going to understand, like Elvis understood the television, and the Beatles understood the recording studio, and Led Zeppelin understood the live concert festivals. These artists are going to understand MTV and how to leverage them, or at least the record companies behind them are. But it's going to become extremely focused on only white listeners and artists. Even top-selling artists such as the Supremes and Michael Jackson are getting less airplay, and some assert that it's probably because they were not white. The record companies continue to grow in size. There's only 4 to 6 record companies by this point, and they are starting to market the music to other countries besides the United States. We start to have a global recorded music market. Country music becomes more popular. Stars such as Garth Brooks start to appeal to rural white Americans. Like I said, these artists are not catered towards rural white. They're catered towards urban and suburban white Americans. And country music is going to really flourish and begin to establish itself firmly as the sound of rural America. Simultaneously, rap music is going to emerge in the 80s, and we all know where that's going to lead to. We begin to have digital music for the first time, synthesizers, and these synthesizers are going to be developed so that people like you and I can use them. We looked at the Pink Floyd synthesizer that they'd used in Dark Side of the Moon. There's this huge wall of wires and cables and plugins. Now we can bring home a little box or a little keyboard. And one of the famous ones was the Roland Tr-808, which was a drum machine. And the 808 drum sound is still one of the most used drum sounds in hip-hop and dance music. There became issues when they start using samples from music that's been listened to before. In fact, I think some of you had analyzed the song Pressure by David Bowie and Queen. When a sample of that song was used by Vanilla Ice, they sued Vanilla Ice and said, you can't use that loop. And it was decided that was true, that a loop in a song or a distinct part of a song can't be used in another song. We start to prepare for some of the changes that are going to happen in the 2000s, where we can listen to multiple albums at a time, and there's this thing called the CD changer where you can have multiple CDs. You could have a couple hundred CDs in your library. The idea is that you would buy lots of music. This is going to lead to iTunes and iTunes Shuffle, because we might want to not listen through a whole album by one artist, but be able to listen through multiple artists and not have to rely on a radio DJ to tell us what we're going to hear. The biggest album of the decade was Michael Jackson's Thriller, and it still is the biggest album of all time. Michael Jackson is not rock and roll. He had come from Motown with Berry Gordy. And they wrote this album as a response to the focus on video games, and they wanted to try to bring people back to listening to music more. That was another reason people thought maybe that record sales had gone down, because the emergence of the video game industry around 1980. The book talks about Bruce Springsteen as well, so you can read up on that if you'd like. And then the idea of producing a celebrity reaches entire new heights in the 1980s. We had seen it before with Bing Crosby. We'd seen it before with Elvis Presley. Artists and record companies start to push this imagery on television via MTV, but also newspapers, magazines, radio interviews, tours. You begin to associate socially with an artist or a genre in a way that people hadn't before. Prince was a very important artist in the 80s who is borderline rock and roll, because he did write his own songs and play some guitar, but most of his music is synthesizer based, and so he's usually considered a pop musician. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our conversation on the 1980s. You have the book readings there, you have the YouTube playlist I'd like you to refer to, and the artists. Thanks, and have a great week.